A frozen foot breaks through the ice on Mount Everest's north face. The boot is ancient, cracked by decades of wind and cold. Inside, faded red letters spell out a name that vanished a century ago. A.C. Irvine. For nearly 100 years, the mountain kept this secret buried beneath tons of snow and glacier ice. Now, as climate change melts Everest's ancient frozen layers, the mountain is finally speaking. And with it comes the possibility of answering mountaineering's most haunting question. Did two men reach the summit in 1924, 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay claimed the prize? The discovery was made in September 2024 by a National Geographic documentary team. They weren't searching for Irvine that day. They were filming glacier patterns when cinematographer Jimmy Chin spotted something unusual protruding from the ice. As they got closer, they realized what they had found. The sock inside the boot bore Irvine's name, stitched in thread that had somehow survived a century of Everest's brutal conditions. The team stood in silence, some fighting back tears, knowing they were the first people to find any trace of Andrew Common Irvine since he disappeared into the clouds on June 8, 1924. George Mallory was already a legend when he set his eyes on Everest for the third time. Born in 1886 in Cheshire, England, he grew up climbing the rocks and crags of Wales and Scotland. By his 20s, Mallory had established himself as one of Britain's finest alpinists. He was graceful on rock, almost dancer-like in his movements, and possessed an intensity that bordered on obsession when it came to mountains. His father was a church rector, and Mallory grew up in a world of discipline and expectation. He attended Winchester College and later Magdalen College, Cambridge, where he studied history, but spent most of his time climbing. At Cambridge, George Mallory met some of the most influential figures in British mountaineering. He joined the Climbers Club and began tackling increasingly difficult routes in the Alps. His climbing style was described as elegant and bold, taking risks that more conservative climbers avoided. He also met his future wife, Ruth Turner, at a country house party in 1914. They married that same year, just as World War I broke out. Mallory served as an artillery officer in France, surviving the trenches while many of his friends did not. The war changed him, made him more aware of mortality and the fragility of life. When asked why he wanted to climb Everest, George Mallory's response became immortal: "Because it's there." But those three simple words masked years of failure, frostbite, and broken dreams that would ultimately consume him. Mallory had already attempted Everest twice before 1924. In 1921, he was part of the first British reconnaissance expedition that mapped routes up the mountain. The team surveyed the northern approaches from Tibet, identifying possible routes through the treacherous ice falls and rock bands. Mallory was the first person to extensively explore the North Col route, which would become the standard approach for decades. In 1922, George Mallory returned to Everest and pushed higher than anyone had ever climbed, reaching over 27,000 feet before being turned back by weather and exhaustion. On that expedition, they used bottled oxygen for the first time in mountaineering history, though the equipment was primitive and unreliable. Mallory initially despised the idea of using oxygen, calling it unsporting and artificial. But after experiencing the debilitating effects of extreme altitude, he changed his mind. That same 1922 expedition ended in tragedy when an avalanche killed 7 Sherpa porters. The guilt haunted Mallory deeply. He blamed himself for pushing too hard, for wanting the summit more than safety. By 1924, George Mallory was 37 years old, considered ancient for high-altitude climbing. His body bore the scars of previous expeditions: frostbitten fingers and toes, lungs weakened by repeated exposure to thin air. His marriage was strained. His wife Ruth wanted him home, safe with their 3 young children, Claire, Berridge, and John. But Mallory couldn't shake the pull of the mountain. Everest had become his white whale, the peak that defined his entire existence. He wrote to Ruth before the final attempt, telling her this would be his last try. Win or lose, he promised, he would come home after this. It was a promise he would never keep. Some historians believe Mallory felt enormous pressure to succeed, not just for himself, but for Britain and the entire climbing establishment. Andrew Common Irvine was everything George Mallory wasn't: young, untested, and bursting with raw potential. Born in 1902 in Birkenhead, England, Sandy, as everyone called him, showed mechanical genius from childhood. While other boys played with toys, Irvine dismantled clocks and rebuilt engines. His father was a successful businessman, and the family was comfortable financially, allowing Sandy to pursue his interests freely. During World War I, while still a teenager, he designed an interrupter gear that allowed machine guns to fire through spinning propeller blades without shooting them off. Military engineers had struggled with the problem for months. Irvine solved it in his bedroom, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that seemed almost supernatural. At Merton College, Oxford, Andrew Irvine became a rowing star. He was built like a machine himself, broad-shouldered and powerful, with lungs that seemed bottomless. In 1923, he helped Oxford defeat Cambridge in the annual boat race, a victory that made national headlines across Britain. Irvine rowed in the number 4 position, considered one of the most demanding seats in the boat. His teammates described him as relentless in training, always pushing himself and others to improve. But Irvine wanted more than athletic glory. He wanted adventure, the kind that tested not just muscle, but mind and spirit. That same year, he joined an Oxford expedition to Spitsbergen, a frozen archipelago north of Norway. The Arctic expedition to Spitsbergen was brutal, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees. But Sandy Irvine thrived where others struggled. The expedition's purpose was to survey glaciers and conduct geological research, but it also served as training for young men who dreamed of greater adventures. Equipment constantly failed in the extreme cold. Stoves refused to light, instruments froze solid, and clothing became stiff as boards. Irvine spent hours each day repairing and improvising solutions. He modified their Primus stoves to work more efficiently, redesigned their sledges to pull more smoothly over ice, and even improved their tent designs. His practical genius impressed everyone on the expedition. George Mallory was also on that Spitsbergen expedition, and he watched Irvine closely. Mallory saw something special in the young man, an ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart, a gift for making broken things work again. Most importantly, Mallory saw someone who could handle the oxygen equipment. The bottled oxygen systems used on Everest were primitive, heavy, and prone to failure. They leaked, froze, and broke at the worst possible moments. Climbers needed someone who could troubleshoot them at 28,000 feet, where the air was too thin to think clearly. Irvine was that person, the mechanical genius who could mean the difference between life and death on the highest mountain on Earth. The decision to take Sandy Irvine to Everest was controversial within the climbing community. He was only 22 years old and had never climbed above 20,000 feet. More experienced mountaineers on the 1924 expedition felt passed over and undervalued. Noel Odell, a geologist and skilled climber, thought he should have been Mallory's partner for the summit attempt. Edward Norton, the expedition leader, had serious doubts about Irvine's lack of high-altitude experience. But George Mallory insisted with characteristic determination. He believed Irvine's technical skills with the oxygen sets would make the difference between success and failure. In hindsight, it was a decision that would either prove genius or fatal. Some expedition members wrote in their diaries that Mallory seemed almost obsessed with taking the young Irvine to the summit. The 1924 British Everest expedition left Liverpool on February 29th, Leap Day, aboard the SS California. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, an extra day in the calendar for an impossible attempt at history. The team spent weeks traveling through India by train, watching the landscape change from coastal cities to the foothills of the Himalayas. They then trekked for another month through Tibet to reach Everest Base Camp, passing through ancient monasteries and villages where locals warned them about the mountain's deadly nature. By modern standards, their equipment was laughably inadequate. They wore wool coats, cotton shirts, and leather boots, with nails hammered into the soles for traction. Their tents were canvas. Their sleeping bags were down-filled, but still left them shivering through the night at high camps. The oxygen equipment was especially problematic for the expedition. Each set weighed over 30 pounds and consisted of steel cylinders, rubber tubes, and a crude face mask. The valves froze regularly in the extreme cold. The masks leaked precious oxygen. Climbers had to choose between the extra weight of carrying oxygen or the torture of climbing without it. In the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body begins to shut down. Sandy Irvine spent hours at base camp and higher camps tinkering with the sets, reducing weight wherever possible, fixing leaks, and improving flow rates. He stripped unnecessary metal parts, lightened the frames, and adjusted the valves to deliver oxygen more efficiently. His mechanical wizardry gave the team hope that oxygen might actually help rather than hinder their summit bid. The expedition established camps progressively up the mountain through May. Camp 3 sat at 21,000 feet, Camp 4 at 23,000 feet, Camp 5 at 25,000 feet, and Camp 6 at 26,800 feet. Each camp was nothing more than a few tents clinging to icy ledges, buffeted by winds that could reach 100 miles per hour. Climbers had to acclimatize slowly, going up and down the mountain repeatedly to let their bodies adjust to the thinning air. Several team members fell ill with altitude sickness, experiencing crushing headaches, nausea, and confusion. Others suffered frostbite that would leave permanent damage. The Sherpas, whose strength and courage made the entire expedition possible, carried load after load of supplies upward, establishing food caches and oxygen depots at each camp. Edward Norton made the first summit attempt without oxygen on June 4th, reaching 28,126 feet before being forced back by snow blindness and complete exhaustion. He had climbed higher than any human being in recorded history, but the summit remained over 900 feet above him, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Norton later described the experience as like drowning on dry land, each breath bringing insufficient oxygen to his starving brain and muscles. His heroic attempt proved that climbing without oxygen was possible, but probably not enough to reach the top. That left one hope: George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, with their oxygen sets, climbing together. They would have one chance, one clear weather window, to do what had never been done before. On June 6th, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine left Camp 4 for the last time. They spent that night at Camp 5, then pushed up to Camp 6 on June 7th. Noel Odell, climbing in support behind them, watched them establish the high camp and settle in for the night. The weather was holding, clear and cold, perfect conditions for a summit attempt. Everything was falling into place. Mallory wrote a final note to expedition filmmaker John Noel, asking him to have the camera ready for their return. There was no doubt in his words, no hesitation. They were going for the summit. They would either succeed or die trying. Mallory also left a note for Odell, detailing their plans and asking him to support from below if possible. June 8, 1924, dawned clear and cold on the upper slopes of Everest. George Mallory and Sandy Irvine left Camp 6 sometime around 5 or 6 a.m., though no exact time was recorded. They carried oxygen, ice axes, rope, and little else. Every ounce mattered at that altitude where each step required enormous effort. Odell, climbing behind them, reached Camp 6 around midday and looked up toward the summit ridge. At 12:50 p.m., the clouds parted for just a moment. Through the gap, Odell saw two tiny black figures moving upward on the ridge. They appeared strong, climbing steadily toward the summit, before the clouds closed in again. That glimpse, lasting perhaps a minute, was the last confirmed sighting of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine alive. What happened next remains one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries. Noel Odell waited at Camp 6 for hours, expecting to see them descending victorious or defeated. When they didn't appear by evening, he knew something was terribly wrong. The next day, he climbed as high as he could, shouting their names into the wind until his voice was hoarse. Silence answered him. Search parties spent days scouring the upper mountain, risking their own lives in desperate hope. They found nothing, no tracks, no gear, no sign that Mallory and Irvine had ever been there. Everest had swallowed them completely, as if they had never existed. The weather turned savage, with storms preventing further searches. The expedition returned to Britain in defeat and mourning. George Mallory's wife, Ruth, was devastated by the news. She had feared this outcome, but hoped against it until the end. Their 3 children, Claire, Barrage, and John, would grow up without a father, forever wondering if he had died achieving his dream or fallen short. Sandy Irvine's mother was heartbroken, her brilliant son gone before his life truly began. The climbing community was shaken to its core. 2 of Britain's best had vanished on the mountain. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Had they reached the summit before dying? Did they turn back short of the goal? Without bodies or evidence, there was no way to know. Memorial services were held, and both men were hailed as heroes who gave their lives to exploration. In 1933, 9 years after the disappearance, British climber Percy Wynne Harris found an ice axe at 27,160 feet on the northeast ridge. It was identified as belonging to either George Mallory or Sandy Irvine, though which one remained uncertain. The axe was lying on rocks, not stuck into ice, suggesting it had been dropped rather than used for an arrest during a fall. Some experts believed the location indicated the pair had been descending when disaster struck. Others thought it proved they had been close to the summit, perhaps even successful. The axe raised more questions than it answered, and Everest kept its secrets locked in ice for another 66 years. The discovery reignited public interest and speculation about their fate. In May 1999, an expedition led by climbers Conrad Anker and Dave Hahn set out specifically to search for George Mallory and Sandy Irvine. They focused on the area where Chinese climbers claimed to have seen a body in 1975. The Chinese account was vague but tantalizing: an English dead lying in old clothing. On May 1st, Anker was searching at around 27,000 feet when he spotted something pale against the gray rock. At first, he thought it was a piece of old tent fabric. As he got closer, his heart began to pound. It was a body, perfectly preserved by the cold, lying face down with arms outstretched, as if still trying to stop a fall that happened 75 years earlier. The body was frozen into the mountain, bleached white by decades of UV radiation. The clothing was intact: layers of wool and cotton, hobnailed boots, a leather belt. Around the waist was a length of broken rope, severed cleanly, suggesting a catastrophic fall while roped to a partner. Conrad Anker and the team carefully examined the body, searching for identification. Inside a shirt collar, they found a name tag: G. Mallory. They had found George Mallory, 75 years after he disappeared. The discovery made headlines worldwide, reigniting debate about whether he had reached the summit. But it also deepened the mystery because Mallory's body answered some questions while raising others that might never be solved. George Mallory's injuries were severe and told part of the story. His right leg was badly broken, bones shattered in multiple places. His forehead bore a puncture wound, possibly from his ice axe striking him during the fall. The rope around his waist was snapped, indicating he and Sandy Irvine had been tied together when one or both fell. Most intriguingly, Mallory's snow goggles were in his pocket, not on his face. This suggested he had been descending in low light, either at dusk or dawn, when goggles weren't needed. Climbers debated endlessly what this meant. Had they summited and were descending late? Or had they turned back before reaching the top and were caught by darkness? The team searched George Mallory's pockets carefully and found letters, a monogrammed handkerchief, and other personal items. But they didn't find what everyone hoped for, a photograph of his wife Ruth. Mallory had famously told friends he planned to leave Ruth's picture on the summit if he reached it, a romantic gesture typical of the era. The missing photograph fueled speculation that he had indeed made it to the top and left it there as promised. However, the photo could have been lost during the fall, blown away by wind, or simply not carried on the final day. Without more evidence, it proved nothing definite. Some forensic experts analyzed the position of his body and theorized he had fallen from above, sliding down the mountain face. What was most frustrating about finding George Mallory, there was no camera. Sandy Irvine was known to have been carrying a Kodak vest pocket camera, borrowed from fellow climber Howard Somerville. If Irvine still had that camera when he died, and if the film inside survived the freezing conditions, it could contain the proof everyone wanted: photographs from the summit of Everest taken in 1924. Kodak experts confirmed that film from that era, frozen at Everest's extreme cold, could potentially still be developed using modern techniques. The emulsion might be damaged, but images could likely be recovered. The camera became a holy grail of mountaineering history. Find Irvine, find the camera, solve the mystery forever. Chinese climber Wang Hongbao claimed in 1979 that he had found a body at around 26,475 feet during China's 1975 Everest expedition. Wang described the body as English dead in old-fashioned clothing, lying at around 8,400 meters. He indicated it was about 20 minutes walking distance from the Chinese camp. Wang made the claim to a Japanese climber, communicating through gestures and broken English because of the language barrier. The next day, tragically, Wang was killed in an avalanche before he could provide more details or show anyone the exact location. His story became another tantalizing clue in the mystery. Had he found Sandy Irvine? If so, why didn't the Chinese report it or recover the body? The questions multiplied, and Irvine remained lost to history. For 25 years after George Mallory's discovery, expeditions searched for Sandy Irvine with increasing desperation. Teams combed the areas where Wang might have walked, scanning couloirs and ice fields with binoculars and drones. Some claimed to have seen anomalies in the ice that could be bodies or equipment. Others found old oxygen bottles and rope fragments from the 1924 expedition. But nothing definitively connected to Irvine appeared anywhere. The mountain seemed determined to keep its final secret buried. Then, in September 2024, everything changed when that boot emerged from the central Rongbuk Glacier, bringing Irvine back to the world after a century of silence. The discovery location was significant for several reasons. Sandy Irvine's boot and foot were found much lower on the mountain, than where George Mallory's body lay, and far down the glacier from the summit route. Glaciologists explained that the central Rongbuk Glacier flows downward over time, carrying anything frozen within it. If Irvine had died high on the mountain in 1924, his body could have been buried in snow, incorporated into the glacier, and slowly transported downward over the course of a century. As climate change accelerated glacier melting in recent decades, the ice finally released what it had held, revealing Irvine's remains after 100 years. Scientists estimate the glacier moves approximately 50 to 100 feet per year. The team that found the boot immediately recognized its historical importance. They documented everything with photographs and GPS coordinates before carefully removing the boot and foot for DNA testing. Sandy Irvine's great-niece, Julie Summers, a historian who had written extensively about her great-uncle, was contacted. DNA samples from Irvine's living relatives were compared with tissue from the remains. In late 2024, the results came back positive. The remains were definitively Andrew Common Irvine. After 100 years, his family finally had closure. But the camera, the precious camera that might contain proof of a 1924 summit, was not with the boot. The search would have to continue if more of his remains are revealed by the melting ice. But George Mallory and Sandy Irvine weren't the only dreamers drawn to Everest by obsession. Another man, more unlikely than either of them, would attempt the impossible a decade later. His name was Maurice Wilson, and his story is even stranger, more tragic, and more inexplicable. Wilson was born in 1898 in Bradford, Yorkshire, into a working-class family. His father was a textile worker, and Maurice grew up knowing hardship and struggle. He fought in World War I, where he was wounded in combat and awarded the Military Cross for bravery under fire. The war left him traumatized, struggling with what we now call PTSD. He drifted through the 1920s, working various jobs in England and New Zealand, searching for meaning in a world that felt broken and purposeless after the horrors he had witnessed in the trenches. In the early 1930s, Maurice Wilson became obsessed with fasting and spiritualism. He believed that through prayer, fasting, and sheer willpower, a person could achieve anything, even the impossible. He claimed to have cured himself of tuberculosis through a 35-day fast combined with intense prayer and meditation. Whether he actually had tuberculosis or merely believed he did remains unclear, but the experience convinced him that faith could overcome any physical obstacle. He read about Everest in newspapers and became convinced that he was meant to climb it, that God or fate had chosen him for this purpose. Not as part of an expedition with experienced mountaineers and Sherpas, but alone, guided by faith and determination. The problem was obvious to everyone but Maurice Wilson. He had never climbed a mountain in his life. He had no training, no experience, and no understanding whatsoever of what high-altitude mountaineering involved. He didn't know how to use an ice axe, couldn't read a map properly, and had never worn crampons. Friends and acquaintances tried to dissuade him, explaining that Everest had defeated the world's best climbers and killed many of them. Wilson dismissed their concerns. He believed his spiritual preparation would transcend physical limitations. He spent months fasting, sometimes going weeks, eating almost nothing, convinced this would make him lighter and able to survive on the mountain without heavy supplies. Maurice Wilson hatched an extraordinary plan that defied all logic. He would learn to fly an airplane, purchase his own aircraft, fly it from Britain to Tibet, crash land on the slopes of Everest at around 15,000 feet, then climb to the summit alone, while fasting and praying. To anyone with even basic knowledge of aviation or mountaineering, the plan was suicidal, impossible, insane. But Wilson was undeterred by criticism or common sense. He took flying lessons in London and bought a used Gypsy Moth biplane for $500, which he named Everest in a play on Everest. British authorities, hearing of his plan, refused to grant him permission to fly to Tibet. They revoked his flying license and warned him not to attempt the journey. Wilson didn't care. He planned to go anyway, with or without official blessing. In May 1933, Maurice Wilson took off from Britain and flew south across Europe in his Gypsy Moth. He navigated across the Mediterranean, through the Middle East, facing sandstorms and mechanical failures. British officials sent cables to stations along his route, ordering them not to refuel his plane. Wilson evaded them cleverly, sometimes landing in remote areas and buying fuel from locals who had no idea he was wanted by authorities. He crashed once in Egypt, but repaired the damage himself using his wartime mechanical skills. After weeks of flying, covering thousands of miles solo, he reached India. There, the British colonial government impounded his plane at Lalbaloo airfield and ordered him to stop this madness. Wilson refused to quit. If he couldn't fly to Everest, he would walk there instead, no matter how long it took. Maurice Wilson traveled to Darjeeling and began preparing to trek into Tibet illegally. The British controlled access to Everest through Tibet and had a strict permit system for expeditions. Wilson had no permit and no intention of getting one. He bought basic climbing equipment from local shops, having no idea what was actually necessary. He hired Sherpa porters who were sympathetic to his determination, 3 men named Tawang, Rinzing, and Tsering. He disguised himself as a Buddhist monk, wearing robes and keeping his head covered to avoid detection. In March 1934, Wilson and his 3 Sherpas set off on foot toward Everest, traveling at night and hiding during the day to avoid British officials who were searching for him. The Sherpas knew this was madness, but couldn't dissuade him and needed the money. The journey took weeks of brutal travel, crossing high passes and barren plateaus in freezing conditions. Maurice Wilson had no idea what he was doing. He didn't know how to use crampons or an ice axe properly. He didn't understand altitude sickness or the necessity of acclimatization, the slow process of letting the body adjust to thinning air. The Sherpas tried to explain the dangers, but Wilson believed his fasting and spiritual practices would protect him from physical harm. He carried minimal food, convinced he would fast his way up the mountain. By April, they reached the Rongbuk Monastery at the base of Everest. The monks were astonished by this strange Englishman who planned to climb the mountain alone. They warned him it was impossible, that the mountain gods would not allow it, and that he would die. Wilson thanked them politely and kept preparing for his attempt. On May 12, 1934, Maurice Wilson began his doomed attempt on Everest. The Sherpas accompanied him as far as Camp 3 at around 21,000 feet, trying to help despite knowing the effort was doomed from the start. Wilson had no idea how to move on ice, constantly slipping and falling. His leather boots, inadequate for high-altitude climbing, gave him no grip. The altitude hit him hard, leaving him gasping and dizzy, his untrained body rebelling against the thin air. After only a few days, suffering from severe altitude sickness, his Sherpas begged him to turn back and save his life. Wilson refused their pleas. He ordered them to leave him alone, insisting this was his destiny. Reluctantly, fearing for their own safety, they descended to base camp. Maurice Wilson spent several more days trying to push higher, crawling through snow, coughing blood, his body shutting down from lack of food and oxygen. He made multiple attempts to reach higher camps, each time being turned back by his deteriorating condition. His diary entries became increasingly desperate and incoherent. He wrote about hearing voices, about his determination to succeed, about his faith sustaining him. He attempted to reach Camp 4 multiple times, but kept collapsing from exhaustion. On May 21st, Wilson made his final diary entry. The words were barely legible, written by a man on the edge of death. He described terrible cold, exhaustion, and the realization that he was beaten. The mountain had won. Maurice Wilson's body was found a year later, in 1935, by members of the British Everest expedition. He was lying in his tent at around 21,000 feet, frozen solid, his diary beside him. The tent was shredded by wind, and Wilson had clearly died of exposure and altitude sickness. The Sherpas who found him buried the body in a crevasse, as was customary, but it later emerged from the ice and was found again in 1960, by which time it had largely decomposed. His remains have been seen periodically since then, a grim reminder of hubris. Some climbers report seeing scraps of clothing and bones near Camp 3, all that remains of Maurice Wilson's impossible dream. Maurice Wilson's story is often dismissed as the folly of a madman, but it's more complex than that simple judgment. He was a broken man searching for redemption, for a purpose that had been taken from him by war. The trenches of World War I had destroyed the world he knew and left him adrift, unable to find meaning in ordinary life. He believed, genuinely and completely, that faith and willpower could overcome physical limitations. He was wrong, tragically wrong, but his courage, however misguided, cannot be denied. He died alone on a frozen mountain, pursuing a dream that was never possible. In his own tragic way, Maurice Wilson belongs in the story of Everest, a reminder that the mountain does not discriminate. It defeats the inexperienced and the expert alike with equal indifference. George Mallory, Sandy Irvine, and Maurice Wilson represent different aspects of the Everest obsession that has claimed so many lives over the past century. Mallory was the perfectionist, the climber who couldn't let go until he'd succeeded or died trying. Irvine was the prodigy, the young genius who trusted his mentor and followed him into the unknown, his potential cut short before the world could see what he might have become. Wilson was the dreamer, the man who believed willpower alone could conquer nature, a tragic figure whose faith exceeded his abilities. All three died on the mountain, swallowed by its storms and ice, their bodies eventually revealed by the slow work of time. Their stories are intertwined, part of the layered history of humanity's attempts to stand where the earth meets the sky. Did George Mallory and Sandy Irvine reach the summit of Everest on June 8, 1924? The evidence suggests they came heartbreakingly close, but close isn't enough when history demands proof. The missing camera remains the key to everything. If it's found and the film can be developed, we may finally know whether two men stood on top of the world 3 decades before Hillary and Norgay. Until that day, the question remains suspended in the frozen air, as eternal and unyielding as the mountain itself. Picture yourself shuffling forward, one slow step at a time. But this isn't an airport security line or a grocery store checkout. You're trapped on the spine of the Himalayas, 8 kilometers straight up, where the atmosphere holds barely enough oxygen to keep a candle lit. You're inching toward a narrow passage called the Hillary Step, a jagged crack in the rock face where only one body fits at a time. Every breath up here burns. Every heartbeat drains your reserves. The person ahead of you hasn't moved in a while. You assume exhaustion. Then you notice the angle of his neck, the way snow has gathered in the creases of his jacket, the absolute stillness. That's not a resting climber. That's a corpse. That's what happens when the world's tallest peak runs out of patience. This mountain doesn't need avalanches or lightning to claim lives. It doesn't require dramatic rescues or screaming winds. Sometimes it just waits. And waiting, at this altitude, is a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Here are 3 men who touched the sky and never returned to tell their families about it. Not because they slipped, not because equipment failed, because they got stuck in a queue where minutes cost more than money could ever buy back. He spent his weekdays closing deals and his weekends dreaming about summits. At 55, most people his age were thinking about retirement portfolios and grandchildren. He was thinking about completing something extraordinary, standing atop the highest point on every continent. The obsession had taken root years earlier and never let go. 7 mountains, 7 summits, a club with fewer members than most people realize. 6 mountains down, 1 to go. He'd already conquered Africa's rooftop, scaled the frozen giant of Alaska, and planted his boots on Antarctica's highest ground. The Andes had tested him. The peaks of Oceania and Europe had fallen. The final checkbox sat 29,000 feet above Nepal, shrouded in clouds and controversy. Spring 2019. He signed with a local outfitter, not one of the prestigious Western companies that charge 6 figures, but a reputable Nepali operation that knew the mountain intimately. He packed his gear, kissed his wife goodbye, and flew halfway around the world to chase a promise he'd made to himself decades earlier. His family worried, as families do. This peak had claimed experienced mountaineers, young athletes, seasoned veterans. Age 55 doesn't guarantee anything up there except harder recovery times and less margin for error. But he'd prepared meticulously, trained his body, studied the route, trusted his guides. The ascent went smoothly. Weeks of acclimatization, rotations up and down the mountain, building strength while his body learned to survive on rationed air. Base camp became home, a chaotic tent city of international ambitions and nervous energy. He made friends, shared meals, watched the weather forecasts like everyone else, waiting for the jet stream to shift and crack open a passage to the top. When the weather window appeared in late May, he made his move. The push from high camp began before dawn, headlamps bobbing in the darkness like a procession of fireflies ascending toward the stars. May 22nd. Golden light spilling over the curve of the earth. He stood where few humans have ever stood, the curvature of the planet visible at the edges, clouds spread below like an ocean of cotton. He pulled out his satellite phone and recorded a message for his family. His voice cracked with emotion. "I feel so blessed. The impossible was now complete. 7 summits, membership in one of mountaineering's most exclusive clubs. But mountaineers have a saying, getting up is optional, getting down is mandatory, and getting down is where the mountain collects its debts." The route back funneled through a bottleneck just below the peak, a vertical scramble over loose rock and fixed ropes that had been tested and retested throughout the season. Years earlier, an earthquake had altered this section, making it even more technical. Now climbers relied entirely on the rope system, clipping and unclipping one at a time as they navigated the narrow passage. That morning, over 200 people had chosen the same weather window. 200 bodies competing for a passage designed for a handful. The result was gridlock at the edge of oblivion. He joined the queue. Minutes stretched into an hour. His oxygen tank gauge crept toward empty. His core temperature dropped degree by degree. The body begins shutting down almost immediately at this elevation. Red blood cells can't carry enough oxygen. Muscles start consuming themselves for fuel. The brain, starved of what it needs, starts making bad decisions, or stops making decisions at all. Around him, others were faltering too, some stumbling, some sitting down and refusing to move, some simply stopping mid-step like wind-up toys whose springs had unwound. The line wasn't moving. Nobody was descending because nobody ahead could descend. The whole system had gridlocked. He didn't call out, didn't wave for attention. The fog of hypoxia wrapped around his brain like cotton, muffling panic, dampening urgency. By the time the danger became obvious, he'd already slipped too far into the abyss of altitude sickness to recognize it. He slipped sideways, and his guides caught him. They forced oxygen into his mask, pumped his chest, shouted his name. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation at 28,000 feet, an act of desperate hope more than medical science. For a moment, his eyes flickered open. Recognition sparked briefly, then closed again. Dragging a grown man down a near-vertical ice face at that altitude isn't heroism, it's suicide. Every step requires energy the rescuer doesn't have. Every minute spent helping is a minute the helper isn't saving themselves. The guides did what they could, until doing more would have killed them too. Then they made the choice every high-altitude rescue eventually demands. They let go. Other climbers shuffled past. Some glanced down. Most kept their eyes forward, focused on their own survival, their own dwindling air supply, their own families waiting below. In that zone, selfishness isn't a moral failing. It's a survival requirement. You cannot save someone else if you're dead. His body settled into the snow just beneath the famous rock step, still dressed in his insulated suit, boots half buried in drift. For a while, descending climbers used him as a waypoint. Bear left after the man in the red suit. A landmark made of someone's father, someone's husband, someone's unfulfilled tomorrow. His daughter later said he believed goals should terrify you. Otherwise, they're not worth pursuing. His widow insisted he died, chasing exactly what made him feel alive, and that didn't qualify as tragedy. Neither statement made the mountain any less indifferent. Neither brought him home. The family eventually decided to leave him there, not from indifference, but from understanding. That ridge was his destination. In a way, he'd arrived. Careful, methodical, the kind of man who read contracts 3 times and double-checked every carabiner before clipping in. At 62, he approached climbing the way he approached litigation, with preparation, patience, and an unwillingness to leave anything to chance. He'd built a career on details. He applied the same rigor to mountains. Same obsession as the salesman from Salt Lake. Same checklist of continental summits. Same final target looming above the clouds. The one peak that separates the dedicated from the merely ambitious. He'd already accumulated an impressive portfolio of summits. The highest points of Africa and South America. The frozen ridges of North America and Antarctica. The final piece had been calling him for years, and 2019 seemed like the season to answer. He joined an expedition that spring, flew into the chaos of base camp, and spent weeks adjusting to the thin air. The acclimatization process is brutal but necessary. Climb high, sleep low, repeat until your body begins manufacturing extra red blood cells to compensate for the oxygen deficit. He followed the protocol religiously. No shortcuts, no impatience. The weather window that spring was unusually narrow. Storms bracketed the summit days more tightly than normal, compressing all the expeditions into fewer opportunities. Teams that might have spread across a week funneled into the same 72-hour period. The pressure built like water behind a dam. When his window came, he climbed. May 27th. 5 days after the infamous traffic jam that made international headlines. Different morning, same pressure cooker. The jet stream had shifted just enough to create a brief opening, and every team within striking distance rushed for the top simultaneously. The photograph that would come to symbolize the season, dozens of climbers lined up along a knife-edge ridge, waiting their turn to stand at the summit, had been taken days earlier, but the conditions that created it hadn't changed. He navigated the crowds as well as anyone could, clipped and unclipped through the fixed rope system, maintained steady, breathing despite the chaos around him, reached the summit as the sun cleared the horizon, stood there, breathless in every sense of the word. 7 continents, 7 peaks. Done. The descent started well. He moved efficiently through the upper sections, rappelling where necessary, down climbing where possible. The fixed lines were crowded but manageable. His body felt the strain. Everyone's body feels the strain up there. But he pushed through. The tent at high camp waited below, promising rest and relative safety. But somewhere in those hours above the clouds, the mountain had already started its accounting. Every minute in the death zone accumulates debt. The body borrows against reserves it doesn't have, mortgaging future function for present survival. You can feel fine and be failing. You can believe you're winning while your organs are surrendering. He made it to the high camp, a wind-swept plateau where tents huddle like frightened animals against the constant gale. The South Col, they call it, a saddle of rock and ice where the atmosphere holds barely a third of its sea-level oxygen. This is supposed to be the safe zone. Get here, and you're practically home. Get here, and the worst is behind you. He collapsed inside his tent. Teammates noticed the change immediately. The slurred words, the unfocused gaze, the way his body had stopped cooperating with his intentions. Altitude sickness manifests differently in different people, but the trajectory is always the same. Confusion leads to incapacitation, leads to coma, leads to death. The only treatment is descent, and descent from the South Col means hours more exposure in conditions that are already killing you. They pumped oxygen, adjusted his mask, called for help that couldn't possibly arrive in time. At that elevation, the air contains about a third of what your lungs expect at sea level. Your heart races even while lying still, trying to pump enough blood to keep critical systems online. Small problems, a forgotten water bottle, a slightly loose seal on your breathing apparatus, a skipped meal, compound exponentially. The margin between fine and finished is measured in minutes, and once you cross it, no amount of intervention can pull you back. He never regained coherence. The teammates who spent hours trying to revive him eventually faced the same impossible math the previous guides had encountered. Help or die. You can't do both. The team that carried news of his death back to Colorado remembered him as someone who finished what he started, no matter how long it took. A man who reviewed every detail, prepared for every contingency, and still lost to the one variable no one can control: time. The plateau where he died has its own grim logic. Even professional rescuers operating there are running on fumes. Helicopters can't fly that high. The air is too thin to generate lift. You can't sprint through waist-deep snow when your muscles are starving for oxygen. Carrying a stretcher requires strength that hypoxic bodies simply don't have. Physics doesn't negotiate. Biology doesn't make exceptions for good people. His family took comfort in completion. He crossed his final finish line, stood where he dreamed of standing, checked the last box on a list that had defined decades of his life. They also acknowledged what everyone was thinking, but few wanted to say. When this many people crowd onto a single route, small delays become fatal equations. The minutes he lost waiting in line were minutes his body couldn't spare. 3 days before his summit push, he posted a warning online. The queues forming near the top, he wrote, could turn lethal. Too many people, too narrow a window, too little margin for error. He'd been watching the patterns, analyzing the forecasts, counting the teams moving into position. The math didn't lie. He studied the situation like the engineer he was, examined the route, calculated the bottleneck capacity, estimated how long climbers would be forced to wait at critical junctions. The numbers spelled danger. He adjusted his schedule deliberately, aiming for May 25th instead of the earlier windows, hoping the initial rush would clear and the crowds would thin. A 44-year-old British climber with expedition experience and a clear-eyed understanding of risk, he knew exactly what waited above 8,000 meters. Knew that your body begins dying the moment you enter that zone. Knew that every extra minute at extreme altitude borrows against a debt you may not be able to repay. He'd rotated high earlier in the season, tagged the intermediate camps, retreated when conditions deteriorated. He understood the game. He went anyway. His reasoning was sound. Later, windows often mean smaller crowds. Teams that rushed the early openings would already be descending or done. By waiting, he hoped to find cleaner routes, shorter delays, better odds. But smart minds think alike. Other teams had made the same calculation. May 25th filled up with climbers who'd all decided to avoid the traffic jam by choosing the same alternative date. The congestion didn't disappear, it just shifted. His team launched from high camp in the pre-dawn darkness, headlamps carving cones of light through the frozen air. The route was well established, the ropes fixed, the path beaten down by hundreds of boots over previous weeks. Everything according to plan. They reached the top mid-morning. Conditions were reasonable, cold but manageable, winds tolerable, visibility acceptable. The views were everything the brochures promised. A 360-degree panorama of the highest peaks on Earth, the sky above shifting from black to navy to brilliant blue. He'd done it, the summit tag that every mountaineer dreams about. Then came the turnaround, and the arithmetic of altitude started its final calculation. Descending from the summit, he felt the symptoms everyone dreads. Nausea that wouldn't settle, confusion that made simple decisions feel impossibly complex, legs that refused to follow simple commands. His partner, one of the Sherpa guides who'd been with him all morning, was experiencing similar problems. Two people in trouble simultaneously, on a fixed line designed for single-file traffic, surrounded by dozens of other climbers fighting their own battles with gravity and oxygen deprivation. The cues that had concerned him from below now surrounded him. Passing wasn't practical. To overtake someone on a fixed line, you have to unclip your safety connection, squeeze past, and reclip on the other side. Simple enough at sea level. Nearly impossible when your hands are numb, your brain is starved, and any slip means a 10,000-foot fall. So they waited. Shuffled forward when space opened. Waited again. Every pause added minutes to his exposure. Every minute subtracted from his reserves. About 150 meters below the peak, he went down. His team tried the emergency protocols. Fresh oxygen cylinder, fluids, verbal commands to keep moving. Nothing worked. His body had reached its limit, crossed some invisible threshold where willpower and preparation stopped mattering. Biology doesn't care about your resume or your training schedule or your careful planning. It cares about oxygen partial pressure and core temperature and ATP reserves. The rescue that might have saved him in any other environment simply doesn't exist up there. No helicopters, no emergency rooms, no medevac teams scrambling to his GPS coordinates. Just thin air and failing organs, and the slow realization that this is how it ends. His Sherpa partner, also struggling, had to be evacuated separately. That split the attention and resources available. Multiple emergencies competing for limited help on a fixed line that only allowed single-file movement. Everyone doing everything possible. None of it enough. He'd written the warning himself. Crowds at this altitude breed tragedy. Delay compounds. Risk. The margins are too thin for error. And then he became proof of his own prophecy. His posts circulated widely after his death. People quoted his prescience, his analytical approach, his sophisticated understanding of systemic risk. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a man who'd identified the exact danger he faced, adjusted his approach specifically to avoid it, and still succumbed. The mountain doesn't grade on effort or preparation or good intentions. It grades on survival. Pass or fail. No partial credit. That spring broke records in both directions. More people reached the summit than ever before. More people died doing it than anyone wanted to count. The photographs from those weeks showed something unprecedented. A human traffic jam at 29,000 feet. Bodies lined up single file along a ridge, narrow enough to span with outstretched arms. People waiting to take selfies at the top, while others waited below, burning through oxygen they couldn't spare, their margin of survival shrinking with every motionless minute. 11 dead in a single season, not from falls or storms or equipment failure, from waiting, from a system that funneled too many dreams through too small a needle, from physics and biology and the brutal economics of oxygen at extreme altitude. The outrage was immediate and global. Newspapers demanded accountability. Families demanded answers. Social media exploded with opinions from people who'd never climbed anything steeper than a Stairmaster. The photograph of the queue became inescapable, shared millions of times, analyzed endlessly, used as evidence in arguments about commercialism and recklessness and the commodification of adventure. Veteran mountaineers shrugged and said they'd seen it coming for years. The permit system had grown bloated with cash. Outfitters had multiplied as demand increased. Standards had softened as competition for clients intensified. What had once been an expedition reserved for elite climbers had become something closer to an extreme tourism package. Pay enough money, pass a basic fitness test, and you too could stand on top of the world. The government issuing the permits had economic incentives to keep the flow going. Each permit brought revenue. Each expedition supported local economies. The Sherpas who did the dangerous work of fixing ropes and ferrying supplies depended on the industry for their livelihoods. Shutting down the circus would hurt the very people it claimed to protect. Arguments erupted over solutions. Cap the permits at some reasonable number? Require more experience before allowing an attempt? Enforce stricter medical screenings to weed out the unfit? Mandate turnaround times that no one could override? Stagger summit windows to prevent everyone from crowding onto the same days? Each proposal ran into the same wall. When money flows this freely and national pride hangs in the balance, reform moves slowly. Committees convene. Reports get commissioned. Recommendations gather dust while the next season approaches and the applications pile up. Some changes eventually came. Tracking devices became mandatory, so rescue teams could locate distressed climbers faster, a small improvement that might shave minutes off response times. Permit fees increased, theoretically reducing demand through price. New regulations demanded fitness certifications and prior high-altitude experience before anyone could attempt the main route. Whether any of it will matter the next time the weather window shrinks and the queues grow remains an open question. The physics haven't changed. Your body still begins shutting down the moment you enter the death zone. Fixed ropes still force single-file movement. Passing someone on a steep face still requires unhooking from the safety line with numb fingers and a hypoxic brain. The fundamental equation, more people equals more delays, equals more exposure, equals more death, remains unsolved. None of these three men sought fame or recognition. None of them took reckless shortcuts or ignored obvious warnings. They trained for months or years, prepared meticulously, hired experienced guides with proven track records, followed established protocols developed over decades of expedition history. They were lawyers and salesmen and professionals, ordinary people by day, dreamers by disposition. The mountains called to them the way art calls to painters or music calls to composers. Something primal and inarticulate. Something impossible to explain to anyone who doesn't feel it themselves. Their families questioned the obsession, as families do. Why risk everything for a view? Why gamble your life against a rock formation that will still be there next year, and the year after, and centuries from now? The mountain isn't going anywhere. But something in these men refused to wait, refused to defer the dream until some safer tomorrow that might never arrive. That kind of quiet commitment deserves respect, not judgment. Most of us never test ourselves against anything more dangerous than highway traffic or career setbacks. We watch from the sidelines as others pursue extraordinary goals, and we tell ourselves we're being sensible. But sensible people don't stand on top of the world. Sensible people don't complete the checklist of continental summits. Sensible people die safe and ordinary deaths, their potential untested, their limits unexplored. These men stared into the void and decided the view from the top was worth the risk at the bottom. The cruelty is how ordinary their deaths were. No heroic last stands against impossible odds. No dramatic rescues that almost worked, but fell short at the last moment. They just stopped. Bodies gave out, lungs quit processing the thin air, hearts surrendered to the impossible demands placed upon them. One died, standing in line, waiting his turn like a customer at a crowded coffee shop. One died, lying in his tent, within sight of safety, his body simply refusing to cooperate any further. One died in the arms of guides who couldn't carry him fast enough down a slope that punished every slow step. The deaths weren't spectacular. They were quiet and ordinary, and utterly preventable by any standard, except the one that mattered, the standard of the mountain, which accepts no excuses and offers no second chances. Veterans of extreme altitude talk about the death zone in almost spiritual terms. Up there, your body is running on borrowed time. Every minute is a withdrawal from an account with no deposits. The mountain gives you a brief window to touch the summit and escape. Miss that window because of weather, because of crowds, because you stopped to take one more photograph, and the interest compounds faster than you can pay it back. These men didn't die because they lacked skill or courage or preparation. They died because the system around them had grown too crowded, too commercial, too willing to gamble that everyone would fit through the bottleneck before the clock ran out. The famous photo of the queue, the one that circulated around the world, was captured by another climber who'd been there that week, watching the same chaos unfold. He survived to tell the story. Many others didn't. The difference wasn't preparation, or fitness, or determination. The difference was luck and timing, and the random distribution of consequences that the mountain hands out without fairness or pattern. Their families chose different ways to remember them. One remains on the mountain, frozen into the landscape he'd spent years dreaming about, a permanent resident of the peak he'd worked so hard to conquer. Others were carried down eventually, when conditions allowed and resources could be spared. The debates they sparked continue without resolution. Every spring, when the weather windows open and the expeditions gear up, someone invokes their names. Remember what happened in 2019. Remember the photographs. Remember that waiting. In line at extreme altitude isn't inconvenience. It's a countdown to organ failure. What changes next remains unclear. Governments move slowly. Commercial interests push back against any reform that might reduce profits. The allure of standing where so few have stood continues drawing thousands of applicants every season. Each one convinced they'll be different. Each one certain they've prepared more thoroughly than the ones who didn't make it back. Perhaps stricter rules will thin the crowds. Perhaps better technology will enable faster rescues. Perhaps some innovation, not yet invented, will change the calculus of risk and reward. Perhaps nothing will change until the next catastrophic season forces the conversation open again. But the lessons are already written in ice. The greatest danger isn't failure. It's success without an exit strategy. It's reaching your goal and discovering you've spent everything it takes to come back. It's forgetting that summits are only halfway points, that the celebration photographs don't show the descent, that standing on top of the world means nothing if you can't get back down from it. The salesman from Salt Lake completed his checklist and left a voice message full of gratitude. The attorney from Boulder crossed his final finish line and collapsed within sight of safety. The engineer who saw it coming wrote his warning and became its proof. Time: 1.0. 3 men. 3 dreams. 3 demonstrations of the same terrible truth. The mountain takes what it wants, when it wants, from whoever happens to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the next time you see a photograph from the top of the world, bright flags snapping in the wind, exhausted faces beaming with triumph, look more carefully. Look at the shadows behind the celebration. Look at the ridge trailing away into the mist. Look at the figures who aren't moving. Some of them never will again. You can do everything right and still lose. You can see the danger coming and walk into it anyway. You can write the warning yourself and become its proof. Because up there, in the zone where the air turns thin and the margin disappears, there's only one truth that matters. Reaching the top means nothing if you can't get back down. And the descent, always the descent, is where the mountain makes its final judgment. Every year, new climbers study these stories and tell themselves they've learned the lessons. They'll be different. They'll be faster. They'll time their summit push better, carry more oxygen, turn around sooner if things go wrong. Maybe they're right. Maybe preparation and determination and luck will align, and they'll touch the sky and return to tell their grandchildren about it. Or maybe the weather window will close early. Maybe the queue will grow longer than expected. Maybe their body will choose that moment to reveal its limits. The mountain doesn't answer questions in advance. It just waits. Patient, indifferent, eternal. While the hopeful line up and the helicopters can't reach, and the minutes tick away. Some will make it. Many will try. A few will become warnings for those who come after, their stories frozen into the landscape alongside their dreams. And the descent will remain what it has always been, the only test that matters. The only question the mountain asks is, can you get back down? Stay safe out there, and never forget, on the highest peak in the world, reaching the summit is just the halfway point. The real story, always, happens on the way home.